In the mid-1960s, the legendary Charles K. Feldman produced an insanely ambitious film with many of the best talent of the day. It stars Peter Sellers, Ursula Andress, Woody Allen, and Peter O'Toole, has an amazing score by Burt Bacharach with a well-known song, features sex, intrigue, and non-sequitur jokes, and was released to mixed reviews at the time but would later go on to gain a cult following. 2 years later, he made Casino Royale. It's hard to separate 1967's Casino Royale from What's New Pussycat once you've seen that film. It helps to give you an idea as to what Feldman may have had in mind when going into this production. This movie, however, is not a resounding success despite that ambition, and often ranks as one of the worst Bond films ever made, if people deign to include it at all. In fact, you could make a good argument that it shouldn't be counted because, despite the fact that it features a character called James Bond, as well as regular supporting characters MQ and Moneypenny, it's a completely different beast to the rest of the series in how it goes about trying to create entertainment. Yes, it's based on, or rather suggested by, the first Ian Fleming novel, and indeed features a surprising amount of connections to the Eon film series. But Casino Royale is a jumbled mess of a comedy that often induces boredom and confusion in equal measure, and doesn't even attempt to be taken as seriously as most of the other films. Despite that, I consider myself somewhat of a defender of the film. Now, I haven't lost my senses. This film is bad. Even if you take it on its own terms and view it as an incoherent, bizarre vignette comedy, it's often not very funny, it's often not interesting, it's poorly hobbled together due to missing footage, and it cannot decide if it wants to be a vignette film with a loose plot, or an interwoven story that likes to take seemingly large detours. However, I do enjoy watching Casino Royale on occasion. On a purely critical level, this is by far the worst of the 27 films we've had so far, but for entertainment value, there's more bang for your buck than you might expect. I mentioned in my last review that both this and Thunderball have the most interesting journeys from book to screen of any of the Fleming novels. Well, I covered a bit of Casino Royale's journey in my first episode, which was a review of the 1954 TV adaptation, so I'll pick up from there. Around the same time as the CBS adaptation, Gregory Ratoff was coming off of a notoriously bad production, and became interested in Casino Royale after reading a review of it in Time magazine. Ratoff was a bit of a compulsive gambler, so he became interested in it more for the subject matter than because of the character of James Bond. He and his partner Michael Garrison, the creator of the Wild Wild West TV show, purchased from Ian Fleming the screen rights for Casino Royale, and only Casino Royale. Ratoff tried for years to get a film made, working a bit with Lorenzo Semple Jr., a respected screenwriter who also weirdly ended up contributing to the other unofficial Bond film, Never Say Never Again. They tried everything from making Bond American to setting the film in the 1940s, and even trying a gender-flipped version starring a Jane Bond. Ratoff died in 1960 with a large amount of debt, and his widow, together with Garrison, sold the rights to Charles K. Feldman, who ended up paying over 10 times what Ratoff and Garrison had originally spent to acquire the rights from Fleming. Feldman then proceeded to work with Howard Hawks, where Hawks imagined Gary Cooper in the leading role. They decided not to proceed after they saw an advance copy of Dr. No, because they felt they didn't want to compete with Broccoli and Saltzman. In 1964, Feldman went to Cubby and Harry to see if Casino Royale could be made with them, which seemed possible given that Cubby was a friend and former employee of Feldman's, and Feldman actually had a production deal with United Artists, the same place that Cubby and Harry had their production deal. However, the deal fell through due to profit division negotiations, and the fact that Kevin McClory was able to successfully negotiate a deal to get Thunderball made. Having spent about $500,000 of his own money into pre-production of this film with little to show for it, Feldman decided the only way the film could get made was if it was a spoof of the Bond pictures, and he went to Columbia Pictures and worked with legendary screenwriter Ben Hecht. After a few more years, and a few other screenwriters, Casino Royale was released in the summer of 1967, a few months before the fifth Eon film, You Only Live Twice. I'm kind of hard-pressed to say this film has a plot, but I'm gonna try and do my level best to recap a bit of this film. Sir James Bond is living in retirement, and several heads of various secret services come to Sir James to beg him to return to active duty. An alarming number of agents have been killed recently, and they feel Bond can help. Bond first travels to the dead M's residence and finds it infested with Smersh agents, all intent on killing him. Upon his escape and return to London, Sir James sets about trying to thwart Smersh's plans by renaming all of the agents James Bond 007, creating an anti-female spy device, recruiting his daughter Mata Bond and sending her to expose a Smersh cover operation, recruiting Evelyn Tremble and sending him to bankrupt Le Chiffre, and discovering the identity of the head of Smersh and foiling their ultimate plan. I wish my summary could be more connected, but anyone who has seen this film knows why it's not. This film has a small story thread that attempts to tie all the major sequences together, which involves Sir James Bond and Vesper Lynd. I almost wish they didn't even bother, as the story thread makes you believe that the plot is leading somewhere that might have all of these sequences add up together into something that makes sense. It does not. And so the result is the equivalent of Homer Simpson's makeup shotgun. It tries to make beauty out of chaos. Now, the Mad Dash productions of the 1960s that are like this can be entertaining, but there's usually something really solid to tie it all together. What's New Pussycat revolves around several different romantic affairs, and everything is connected to the sex addict played by Peter O'Toole. It's a mad, 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 mad world focused on a suitcase of money that everyone else is after. I guess the main connection between all of these plots is that they are unrelated attempts by Sir James Bond against Smersh, except it's inconsistent even about that. The detour with Mata Bond directly sets up the battle between Tremble and Le Chiffre, one of the few things adapted from the original text. And yet the card game has nothing to do with Dr. Noah's plan that somehow involves both replacing world leaders with clones and biological warfare that makes all women beautiful and kills all men over 4'6". One of the saving graces in this film is the cast, and that's not a pithy platitude on my part. This is a phenomenal lineup. The great David Niven plays the original James Bond, appropriate given that Ian Fleming once cited him as a favorite to play Bond. Whatever the character inconsistencies or odd beats, Niven seems to play the character with full authority, and seems to be having a great time. He certainly plays up the gentleman aspect of the phrase gentleman spy, and never seems to miss a step. Anyone will come to him with the wildest of stories or claims, and he just takes it in stride. If Connery embodies cool, Niven embodies gracefulness, and I really appreciate that no matter what's going on, I can always count on Niven to carry me through the film. He also gets one of my favorite lines. Early on, he's criticizing the heads of the secret services for all the gadgets they carry on their persons by calling them joke shop spies. My personal preference in Bond films has always been for a Bond that relies on his own wits and ingenuity to get out of situations. That doesn't mean he can't use gadgets, but the series often gives the impression to casual fans that Bond has a trick up his sleeve for every situation, and that the technology will save him. This is one of the few times where the film seems to actually be critiquing something about the official series beyond the tired sex addict gag, and I really appreciate it. Woody Allen is my other favorite cast member. He's not in a lot of the movie, but he also gets to deliver some of my favorite moments and lines. The scene early on with him escaping execution only to wind up in another is exactly my kind of humor, and so I laugh wholeheartedly there. His scene with Dahlia Lave also has a few good moments, like his line about tying up women in the Boy Scouts. The rest of the cast fares from good to wasted talent. Deborah Kerr is a bizarre choice for the role of Agent Mimi, but she sells the melodramatic ridiculousness so well that I actually get a kick out of it. I really wish I could see both her and Niven in an actual character-driven piece together. I see Mimi as the comedic flip of Fiona Volpe. Both women are specifically targeting the criticism that Bond can bang a woman over to the side of good. Volpe deals with that in a more down-to-earth and deconstructive sort of way. Agent Mimi is an exaggeration of that idea. I also love the joke that both she and the original Moneypenny end up in a convent because they can't have Sir James romantically. Like, there's no release for their sexual tensions, so they'll just go to the extreme opposite route and become cloistered women devoted to supreme service. Also, is it a coincidence that Agent Mimi is impersonating a Lady Fiona? I've already talked a bit about Orson Welles' Le Chiffre in another video, but he's one of the strangest casting choices here. He's a phenomenal powerhouse of an actor and talent, and he's clearly not that interested in playing this role. The magic tricks aren't at all entertaining, mostly because the idea of illusion disappears when you know you're watching a film that is edited. He's not playing the role as a man scared of being caught or killed by his own organization, and so I have no clue what the character is supposed to be other than Welles having fun where he can. And maybe that's enough for some people, but I'm not getting the same enjoyment out of it because I feel like the film is wasting my time. Joanna Pettit, Barbara Boucher, and Terence Cooper are all fun in their brief roles, Pettit in particular. Boucher and Cooper are largely confined to about 10 minutes of the film, and so they tend to fade from my memory once the film is over, and Cooper is the one that gets the rawer end of the deal. The filmmakers spend a few minutes building him up to be an important part of Sir James's defense against Smersh, and then he only comes back in the end at Smersh's base. I go back and forth on Ursula Andress. I guess I kinda like the gag of how obvious it is that she's a villain since she's doing nefarious things from the very beginning, but she doesn't add much to the film because even she's inconsistent. Sometimes she's doing things for her own self-interest, sometimes she's an agent for Sir James at her own expense, and at the end, she says she did it all for love, but doesn't expound on that. I am just so confused. In a much better spy parody like Austin Powers or Johnny English, there are indeed ridiculous characters, but Powers and English are fairly consistent in who they are and the kind of humor that they do. Even the ridiculous characters that surround them are used throughout the film in key roles that help move the farce forward, and you're never confused as to what is going on. Consistency of character is key to a good parody, and this film is just a lock that has no such key. Speaking of inconsistency, the final core member of the cast to talk about is Peter Sellers. I've seen Peter Sellers in a lot of things, and he's an actor that can be uproariously funny when given the right part. Yet Evelyn Tremble is also unpredictable in a bad way. In one moment, he's the straight man in this mad dash of insanity, and in the next, he's playing things like it's the next Pink Panther film. I know he was a troublesome actor to work with, and his exit from the film partially doomed the production. But even in the scenes which we do have, I'm just left with a blank stare as to what he's trying to do. The excellent biopic film, The Life and Death of Peter Sellers, starring Geoffrey Rush, suggested that Sellers wanted to play the role straight and be a potentially serious James Bond substitute. I guess there's credence to that idea in several places, but there are bits where he's talking about beggars in the marketplace, and the Lotus Formula 3 gag, which doesn't mesh with that idea. By the way, I'm aware that the Lotus scene was an outtake that was put in place for an actual card chase that they couldn't get around to filming before Sellers' walkout. Beyond the erratic characters and the threat of a plot, another major issue I have with the film is the editing. Now, part of this was because Peter Sellers walking off the set meant that crucial connecting scenes had to be dropped or rewritten in order to accommodate this problem. However, even in the footage that we do have, there's lots of sped up footage that doesn't need to be, complete jump cuts to disconnected scenes or moments, stock footage from other sources. This film is just all over the place. The section from the end of the card game to the kidnapping of Mata Bond is so rushed and energetic that I originally couldn't keep up with what was going on and had to rewind that section a couple of times. Large sections of this film are just boring and dull. The two big examples are the Mctari Castle and Mata Bond's infiltration. And the reason I don't connect with much there is because they are large tangents that don't move the story along except for one plot point. The point of the Mctari Castle is to demonstrate that Smersh is using women to go after Bond in the Secret Service. The point of the infiltration is that Le Chiffre's only recourse now is to play Baccarat in order to raise the money. And yet, I still have so many questions during these sequences because the word connect is just something this film scoffs at. Why the need to spend so much time in the Mekhtari Castle if none of the rest of the film is going to keep using beautiful women to go after Sir James? If none of these people are M's family, what happened to his actual family? Aren't there easier ways to kill Sir James than a game of wassailing and a homing button with an exploding bird? In fact, I could do the rest of this review with a list of questions that don't make sense. Here are just a few that I haven't asked yet. I did say towards the beginning of this review that I'm somewhat of a defender of this film, and so I'd like to present some evidence of that. The production design is next level awesome. The idea of Bond's retirement home being a place where time has no bearing is brilliant. I could imagine an actual Bond film working off of the same idea, and it's not too far off from Bond's retirement to the Caribbean in No Time to Die. Bond surrounds himself with old-fashioned decor and relaxed living. And I imagine it's what Fleming had in mind when he had the GoldenEye estate built, a true escape from the outside world and its problems. This film just presents another spin on that notion. The confusing asymmetrical layout of the Smersh cover base fits right in with the tone of that section. Mata Bond has entered into a place of espionage and evil with no clear route out. The psychedelic rooms of the actual Smersh base do a great job of enticing people deeper into the mystery of what Smersh is and who runs it. In a way, I see it as an acid trip version of a funhouse. And when the film needs to tone it down with the haphazardness, it does several designs that honestly feel right at home with the Eon series. The casino is exactly what I imagined it to be when I read the original novel. M's office in this film feels pretty similar to M's office in the Eon films, and I don't think it would have been too weird to have had Sean Connery and Bernard Lee do their scenes in a place like this. The score is also fantastic. The late Burt Bacharach does a mostly jazzy score that accentuates the fun where it needs to. The main title theme reappears often in the film, and I hum right along with it. The Look of Love is a perfect accompaniment to the film and makes for some great melodic background music. My favorite bit is when we get to Dr. Noah's lair and see all the gun-toting girls. Bacharach adds in some bells to help add grandeur to the scene, and I could have used a lot more of things like this. The weird bit of music that plays during the Smersh cover bass scene is another great addition, with that haunting piano trill and the reverberating wooden percussion. It's totally the right sound for this kind of a film, and it turns out the score has quite a bit of notoriety to it. The original LP release is considered something of a gem for audiophiles due to its quality, and unfortunately none of the later releases seem to be able to duplicate this due to the original masters being damaged during a remastering. Oddly, this film has a lot of connections to other Bond projects. I've already shared some of them, so here are just 10 more that I observed. Cloning world leaders and replacing them was an idea that was later used in the video game Agent Under Fire. In the torture scene with Peter Sellers, there is a carpet beater tucked into the chair. The original novel had Le Chiffre beat Bond's privates with the same thing. There is a reference to Peter Lorre, who played Le Chiffre in the 1954 TV adaptation of Casino Royale. There are a number of cast members in this film that had or would go on to play roles in official Eon films, Ursula Andress being the big obvious one. But Vladek Shabal from Russia with Love returns here as a different character. Milton Reed appears as one of Mata Bond's servants. He also appeared as a guard for Dr. No and would later go on to play Sonder in The Spy Who Loved Me. Caroline Munro, another cast member from The Spy Who Loved Me, plays an uncredited guard in this film. There were at least 9 different people that I could find in this cast. Herb Alpert and his band played the title song. He was married to Lonnie Hall, who would later go on to sing the title song for Never Say Never Again, and I believe Herb even played a solo trumpet for that score. Bond being in a secluded place and surrounded by women working for the bad guys is an idea that would later resurface in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, as is biological warfare. Both of the Bond films from 1967 feature exploding cigarettes. Le Chiffre cheating at cards reminds me of Sir Hugo Drax cheating at cards in the Moonraker novel. Plus, X-ray sunglasses would later appear in a few official Bond films and games. Some of the gadgets Sir James calls out are oddly similar in function to later gadgets that Bond comes across in the Eon films. Jeffrey Bayldon is now the third man to play Q. He actually appeared in A Night to Remember, the best film about the Titanic that's not the James Cameron version, with both Desmond Llewellyn and Peter Burton, the other two actors who have played Q so far in the Eon films. As a further coincidence, that film also starred Alec McCowan, who would go on to play Q in Never Say Never Again. Finally, I can't end this review without mentioning that this film weirdly gives credence to the codename theory. In case you're not in the know, the codename theory is a fan theory that attempts to reconcile how we could be watching James Bond in 1962 in his 30s and how we could still be watching Bond in his 40s in 2002. I personally don't support the codename theory for several reasons, but this film actually builds upon that idea as a supposedly central plot element. Sir James, upon retirement, gives his name and title to an unnamed agent in this film that is referenced several times, clearly meant to be a jab at Sean Connery. Plus, he decides to rename all of his agents James Bond 007. Obviously, the codename theory wasn't even around at this time, as Connery was just finishing up You Only Live Twice, and the producers hadn't decided what next to do after Connery left the role. Just an interesting coincidence. Casino Royale from 1967 is fascinating. The production history, the standout elements, the influence it had, all these amazing little touches and jokes, they all add up to a bizarre conclusion. It's a massive misfire. On paper, this is clearly the worst film to carry the James Bond name, and many fans would just as soon like to forget it even exists. Yet, I can't look away from it. I do get bored watching this film for large stretches, so you may wonder how I could put this above some of the more serious Bond productions. The reason is that while story and cohesiveness play large factors in how I judge a film, the overriding factor is pure entertainment. I find more entertainment in certain aspects and sections of this film than in something like, say Never Again. I can perfectly understand why this film would line the bottom of most people's lists. I think it's a fair choice, and you can make solid arguments for it. Notwithstanding the film's many failures, I do think it has more than a few things to like, and it's far more unique than many of the other entries. That uniqueness doesn't necessarily translate to quality, but it's a bizarre and unforgettable experience, and as long as I'm not watching the film multiple times in quick succession like I did for this review, I can get some entertainment from the bizarreness.